We're recording this interview on August 7th, and earlier today, a group of, new Donald Trump tariffs came into effect. And if you're like me, you're probably just as you confused about what is subject to a tariff, what isn't, and how it's affecting global trade. So I've decided to interview a specialist, Dr. Peter Morrow, who's a trade economist from the University of Toronto. So welcome to the interview, Peter.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
This is confusing, and it almost seems to be confusing by design. And before we get into the specifics, is there a strategy coming out of the Trump White House that is emerging, or is this more of the Donald Trump chaos that we're accustomed to?
It's quite difficult to tell the degree to which there is a strategy or if it's all confusion or if confusion is the strategy. The I think that President Trump has embraced his more aggressive side after there were some people who claimed that he sometimes would backtrack on threats. And I think he's really using all the power of the US economy to really extract what he views as concessions.
And it seems like he wants to reindustrialize the United States and bring back manufacturing jobs, and particularly from China, it would appear. Is that, but I don't understand why he thinks that punishing, because apparently today's tariffs apply to 69 countries,
Mhm,
and some of them are really tiny.
mhm.
And it just seems that he's upending the global trade order for no benefit.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I'm sure that he sees a benefit to this. I mean, it is absolutely true that a lot of the major trade partners that we really think about as being important for the United States trade relationships either have come up with deals as they're called, or there's something coming online soon, such as with Mexico. So I really think that these small country trade deals are really not that important in terms of they're very important to those countries. I think they're less important to the United States. And one thing I think is important to understand here is the degree to which these are deals in quotation marks as opposed to traditional trade agreements. Traditional trade agreements, you have a trade representative from each country sit down. There's long, legally binding language that is iterated on for months, sometimes years. And what we're seeing now is much more vague promises that after the fact, the two sides don't even agree that that's what was agreed upon. So I think it's really not a lot of stuff is being resolved right now.
The trade agreement or trade deal that was
Hmm.
announced with the European Union would be an
Hmm.
example of that, I would assume,
Hmm.
because Trump claimed that there were going to be $750 billion of energy products that would be purchased by the EU by
Hmm.
2028. The EU very quickly came out and said, no, 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 that's aspirational. That's not where we're going. We don't think that's where it's going at
Hmm.
all. Well, let's talk about Canada for a moment. The
Hmm.
tariffs as of this today are
Hmm.
supposedly pegged at 35%.
Hmm.
Is that a real 35% or just on those goods that don't come under the existing trade agreement?
I mean, it's definitely a real number, but you are quite right to focus on the degree to which goods fall under the Canada-US free trade agreement, which Trump himself negotiated. The best estimates that I've seen from the Bank of Canada, from private banks in Canada, from various government agencies peg the proportion of Canadian exports to the US that will not be subject to these tariffs at between 85 and 95%. So the vast majority of Canadian exports are not going to be subject to these 35% tariffs. What I think is more important is the degree to which this becomes a threat point if a new Canada-US free trade agreement can't be agreed upon next year in 2026.
Yeah, our understanding is that there were the negotiations between the U.S. and Canada essentially ended on August 1st with no agreement in sight, no deal in sight. What's your take
Mhm.
on that?
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, nothing would surprise me at this point, I think, after the last 6 months. My personal view is that the soonest that this gets resolved is with the 2026 review of Kusma. And perhaps not even then. I think that we're going to, because there's really not that much unless the agreement is torn up, which is always possible. Not much is going to change between now and then if we do keep with that 85 to 95% exemption rate.
Which industries are hardest hit in Canada? Would it be steel and aluminum?
Yeah, so I think steel and aluminum are definitely the ones that everyone keeps an eye on. I think in a more general trade war without the exemptions, I'd be more worried about the auto industry, the energy industry. But steel and aluminum are the strategic industries right now that seem to be in the crosshairs, more out of a desire by Trump to protect the US steel industry than anything else.
What about oil and gas? This is obviously a
Mhm,
lot of interest to our viewers, especially in
mhm.
Alberta. Uh, is the tariff still at 10%?
I believe so. I believe so. I think you'd want to check on this on a day-to-day basis. But I would want to double check.
Okay, so the impact on the oil and gas industry in Canada has been fairly muted,
Mhm,
10%, because as I recall, there was talk about the refineries would take a chunk of that 10% and the consumer would pay part of it, and the impact on the producers would be 3, 4, 5%, which they
mhm.
could tolerate. So more or less the status quo on the oil and gas side. And where do we see this? What impact is this likely to have on the American consumer? Because I'm looking at some numbers here, and the share of U.S. good imports that were facing higher duties prior to Trump was 15%, and now it's 72%. That would seem to be bad news for American consumers.
I, Energy is one of those goods where Trump hitting Canada over the head with tariffs really does hurt US consumers. And I would be shocked if he really came out at the energy sector guns blazing, because I think he and his advisors understand that some of these, any higher tariffs would be passed on to US consumers.
Yes, I would agree, though I suppose it's debatable as to what the president understands or doesn't understand, or his advisors understand or don't understand. So where are we going with all of this, Peter?
Mhm,
One of the issues that has come up is that the tariffs themselves aren't maybe the most don't inflict the most damage. It's the uncertainty and the effect
mhm.
on investors that in fact is the real issue here. What's your take?
I completely agree. Uncertainty is a really big problem for any sort of forward-looking decision, like investment in physical capital, hiring workers who you want to keep around for a long time. And, until January, all anyone could talk about was Canada's productivity problem, and there's still a productivity problem. And any sort of damper on investment that uncertainty, for example, might induce really could make things worse.
What a, what about then the these countries that are sort of holdouts, haven't got a deal yet? Because
Mhm,
if I understand this correctly, if you reach some kind of a deal with
mhm,
Donald Trump, then you're either exempted or you get a much
mhm,
lower tariff. If you don't have a deal, then you
mhm,
get punished.
mhm.
Is that how this is likely to play out over the next year or two, where everybody's scrambling to get a deal?
I think we're going to see that over the next couple months. I'm hesitant to forecast anything over the next couple years. I think tons of stuff can change. But one thing that we do see in these, and again, use quotation marks, deals, is very vague pledges about investment that these countries will undertake. Japan there was Trump advertised that Japan was going to invest a bunch of money in the United States. It turns out it's more loan guarantees. You brought up the EU example before. There was a Trump claimed that they promised they were going to buy energy. The EU actually doesn't have the power to mandate purchasing decisions. It's up to the countries that comprise the EU. So, I think there might be, for a lot of these smaller countries, there might be transfers of resources that would may either benefit the Trump administration directly or give the image of benefiting them directly.
One of the stories that we cover closely here at the Energy Media is the emergence of China as an electrotech power, geopolitical power.
Hmm.
And Trump has very clearly positioned the United States as a oil and gas power, energy dominance in the areas
Hmm.
where because they're already the biggest oil and gas producer in the world.
Hmm.
How do these tariffs, if you advance Trump's agenda in
Hmm.
its geopolitical struggle with China? Does it hurt? Does it help? Do we know?
I don't think we can forecast with 100% certainty what's going to happen. I think one of the things that we do see is that China's being very aggressive in moving towards clean energy in terms of electric vehicles, solar panels. It's really dramatic, and the United States is going in the exact opposite direction. So, in terms of rolling back funding and subsidies for clean energy. So they're really, I mean, again, they're going in opposite directions. And the question is who's going to be better positioned for how things shake out in the long run. If the world decides that it wants to buy electric vehicles, there's only so long that the United States can hold out, sort of analogous to the 80s with Japanese import competition. And it's really good. They're really taking opposite sides of this bet, and it's not obvious how it's going to shake out.
And that uncertainty must be a real problem for Prime Minister Mark Carney and his advisors, because Carney has said no further deeper integration of the American
Hmm.
and Canadian economies. But what happens globally with respect
Hmm.
to oil and gas exports maybe now is being
Hmm.
called into question. So, how much does this uncertainty play into the strategy that Mark Carney is advocating for Canada?
I think it's fairly dramatic. I mean, you really have to do some careful arithmetic. You need to think probabilistically and not in terms of one event happening or not happening. You really have to think about the entire distribution of events, and you have to internalize also that things may or may not change in 4 years. The United States might keep going down this direction or might go the opposite direction. And I think so. I think the one thing they shouldn't do, and I think they understand this, is put all their eggs in one basket.
Right. And what by that you mean we're talking about various sectors that might be
Yeah,
expanded and or value
yeah,
add, that
yeah,
sort of thing.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so I think the theme of the interview so far, Peter,
Hmm.
is just we don't really know. There's so much uncertainty in that's been created in the last 6 months that it's
Hmm.
anybody's guess how this really will shake out 6 months, a year, or by the end of Trump's term.
Yeah, and something else I want to add is that the trade war as it is hasn't really escalated. There's been, I mean, you go back to February when the Canadian dollar was losing value dramatically because everyone was fearing the worst. A lot of those big threats weren't implemented. And with the exemption, they're still not being implemented. So there's the trade war isn't happening. I think people are lining up their troops and for a battle that may or may not come. Again, and that ties back into the uncertainty as well. But when we talk about the effects of the trade war occurring or not occurring, they really haven't been. Excuse me, the trade war hasn't really been implemented to its full strength.
What percentage of its strength would you say it has been implemented to? Because this
Oh
almost in a
gosh.
way is looks like a Trump 1.0,
Yeah.
where lots of bluster, lots of grand pronouncements and
Yeah.
press releases. And then when you look at the fine print, you go, well, what really changed?
Well, I think in terms of uncertainty, it's been implemented quite dramatically, but that's not a policy. That's I don't think that's what we talk about when we talk about trade wars per se. I think the tariffs, I think, have been, let's use the exemption number. I think it's been increased by 5%, and that's just the share that is subject to these tariffs. And so there's a remaining 95% that hasn't been.
So if I could wrap this up, Peter,
Mhm,
say that maybe Donald, there's some kind of a strategy brewing in the White House.
mhm,
Tariffs are the
mhm,
primary means of implementing it.
mhm,
The global rules-based order we've had since 1945 is being undermined and is changing. Canada is kind of caught in the crosshairs because, we're worried about trade, but on the other hand, not much has really changed.
mhm,
And so we're undertaking this new strategy of, exporting to Asia and Europe and
mhm,
adding new value, all of that kind of stuff. Is it not the case, maybe, and again, I'm asking you to take out your
mhm,
crystal ball,
mhm.
this might turn out to be a gift for Canada. This maybe it's been the kind of crisis for us that has created the political will to do things like a national power grid that we've talked about for decades, but never could get our political ducks in a row. And Donald Trump may be doing us a favor by jolting us out of our complacency.
Yeah, I think the analogy, I'm not sure I'd call it a gift. I think that's being a little too optimistic. But I'd use an analogy of, especially in education where I'm employed, of COVID. COVID really changed. It was by no stretch of the imagination was it a good thing. It's a bad thing. But we learned there were certain projects that we under used that opportunity to undertake, such as more technology-based learning. And I think there's an analogy there here that you sort of touched on, is that this isn't a good thing. But if this sort of lights a fire under policymakers to really do some of the things that they've been putting off, I think that's a good byproduct.
Well, and that's probably about the most we can say at this point. Peter,
Yeah,
thank you very much for this. We'll be checking in with you in the future because this is still a very confusing story, and we
yeah.
will continue to try to bring some kind of insight into it. So thank you.
I appreciate it. It's been lovely talking with you.